You must do HMOs. How many times have you heard that? There are so many people beating this drum and have been doing so for a number of years. However, I believe there's 3 things you absolutely must understand before you can answer that question. Hi, I'm Saj Hussain, also known as the Property Joint Venture Expert and your partner for wealth creation through property. And welcome to episode number 3 of the Saj Hussain Show. Whether you're new to property or whether you've been investing in property for some time, you've probably had a barrage of people telling you that you need to be investing in HMOs. So what is a HMO? A HMO stands for House in Multiple Occupation. Effectively, it's referring to 3 or more unrelated people in a property with some shared facilities. Those shared facilities might be a kitchen, lounge, living room, bathrooms. They tend to be the areas that are communal within a house. So I remember when I was at university a long time ago now, and there was 4 of us within the property. It was a 3-bedroom house, and one of the reception rooms was also used as a bedroom. So technically that was a HMO. Now there's many other terms that are also used for a HMO, and sometimes people refer to them as house shares, multi-lets, shared accommodation, shared houses. These are all terms that are effectively referring to the same thing. It's a number of people living together that are unrelated in a shared house. The reason investors are interested in this particular strategy right now in this climate is because the profitability that you'll get from a shared house versus a family occupying property. Now in this video, I want to share what I believe are the 3 key things you really need to understand before you can consider whether HMOs are right for you. So the first thing is really understanding your operating environment. Just like when starting any business, you need to really understand the environment that you're going to be working in and whether any rules and regulations apply. And HMOs, there are lots of regulations. There's some national rules and guidelines that apply as well. And depending on where you're working with the country, that can make a difference. So let me give you an example. I remember a few years ago, I think it was probably 5, maybe 6 years ago, I was looking at a project in Dudley. Now I'm based in Birmingham, and we have surrounding areas like Dudley, Wolverhampton, Walsall, Coventry, and they all have different councils, but effectively they all follow the same guidelines in terms of how to work. They're actually all even based in the West Midlands. But I remember when I had the conversation with the HMO officer in Dudley, the suggestions he was giving me for the project I was looking at there in terms of what he wanted me to do was different to what I had done to a similar project in Birmingham. Now you'd think actually they're both referring to the same guidelines, so they should be actually giving me the same advice. But no, that wasn't the case, and this is why I think it's really important to make sure you fully understand the environment that you'll be working in. So, you know, if you're based in London and you're looking to invest in Liverpool, so you'll speak to the Liverpool HMO officers just to understand what their requirements are for HMOs in that particular area. Now, as I said, it's quite a regulated area. There'll be some properties that'll be classed as unlicensed they may not be interested in right now. But hold fire, there's some potential changes coming to the market soon in terms of regulation, which will mean even those properties that we currently class as unlicensed may come into the fold of having to be licensed in the near future. So as I mentioned earlier, it tends to be properties where there's 5 or more people that are unrelated to each other, and the property in question is 3 or more stories. So if there's 5 or more people and it's 3 or more stories, then that falls under a licensed HMO. So for example, if you've got say 6 people in a 2-story property, that's not licensed, generally speaking. And if you've got 4 people in a 3-story property, again, that wouldn't be licensed. So sometimes when you're speaking to the HMO officer, they may not be interested in that particular property if it's unlicensed. It just depends how busy they are and how much time they can give you. But I'd really encourage you to start there. Start with your local authority in terms of what help and support they can give you within what the rules and regulations they have. Now, another important thing to be aware of is Article 4. Now, you may have heard this term. It was September 2012, I think, that it was brought into force. And effectively, what it means is when we're taking a traditional dwelling, a house, as I mentioned earlier on, the student one that I used to live in when I was at university, that was really just a family house with 4 of us living there. So technically its use changes, and the change of use from a planning point of view is C3 is what is a traditional family house being changed to C4, which is a HMO. Now, normally what we can do is, under permitted development, we can change a normal dwelling into a HMO without any planning requirements, generally speaking. So what Article 4 and the Article 4 direction, what effectively it means is the councils now have the right to remove that permitted development that exists from changing properties from C3 to C4. Ultimately, what it means is now you'd have to apply for planning permission when you're changing a property which is a normal house into a HMO. Now that's very different from licensing, and sometimes people get mixed up with those two things. In fact, I was just this week speaking to an investor friend of mine, a very, very experienced investor, been doing property probably way before I was even born. And he was telling me about a 10-bedroom HMO that he has. And he said, I've got the license for it, and I thought that's great. And we were talking about planning, and he says, well, what planning? I've not got any planning on it, I don't need it, I've got the license. But essentially, they're two very different things, and sometimes people forget or don't realize that planning applications may need to be made separately to HMO license applications. So these things are all dependent on the area that you're in, your local council, the requirements they have, and what you'll need to do. So if you're, generally speaking, if you're taking a house and turning it into a 6-bedroom HMO, you can do that under permitted development. If you're going beyond 6, i.e. 7, 8, 9, 10, beyond that, then you need to apply to planning for change of use from C3 to C4. Now, some councils are quite open to look at those, and others may not be. So for example, here in Birmingham, around the university, we now have a patch of area which is classed as Article 4. That means within that area, I can't just buy a standard house and convert that to a HMO. Not a big problem for me because I don't do student HMOs, I only do professional lets and workers, so not really so much of an issue. But effectively what that means in that area, now creating more HMOs can be a little bit of a challenge. Now it doesn't mean they'll never issue any more HMO approvals there, but generally speaking it means they put the controls in place because they're not looking to add any more in that area. They feel that there's already too many there, and they want to control and maintain some traditional family houses there as well. Now that you've done some research, you understand the rules and regulations in terms of operating within the borough that you want to work in. The second thing that I believe is important is understanding your market that you'll be operating in. So what I mean by that is, what type of tenants are you going to be providing accommodation for, and also the type of buildings that you'll be looking to use for HMOs. So with tenants, there are many different categories. So for example, you've got professional lets, you've got workers, you've got students, you've got asylum seekers, you've got people that are on benefits, and many others as well. And it's important to choose which category you want to work in and stick to that. I think mixing those categories within the same house can potentially be a recipe for disaster. And that's come from a little bit of experience at the beginning by trying to mix people that are students and workers together. And I just found that was quite a challenge. Now, my focus has been over the last few years really just professional lets. Our portfolio is predominantly professional lets. I'd say probably about 70-75% professional lets, and 25 to 30% of those what I just class as workers or blue collar. So just a little distinction how we describe some of our tenants. White collared seem to be the ones that are probably higher paid, work at a desk, for instance, and the blue collar ones tend to be ones maybe slightly lower paid, still working, but they might be, for example, in a driver's job, work in a retail, in a warehouse. They tend to be our typical tenant categories. Now, having those two together in the same house, we find kind of works okay. Our preference is to try and keep those categories separate if possible. But just thinking about what type of tenants is it that you're looking to provide accommodation for. Now, I've chosen professional lets and workers. It doesn't mean that actually student lets and unemployed doesn't work in this area. They absolutely do, and I know a number of people that actually do really well using the other tenant categories. However, my belief is that you should pick one thing, do it really, really well, and that's what I've chosen to focus on. So we started off doing professional lets and just continued to do that. Now, I believe there's two reasons that people choose to live in HMOs. The first one is because they like the idea of living with other people and having an environment that's quite social. That's one of the reasons they choose to live in HMOs. They typically tend to be people that were maybe students previously, so they're graduates now, they've lived with people previously and they want to continue doing that rather than going off and living on their own just yet. The other category of people that I think live in HMOs tend to be ones that's all they can actually afford. Their budget will only allow them to stay within a shared house. It wouldn't stretch as far enough for them to have their own accommodation, and that wouldn't quite work for them. So to give you an idea in terms of pricing of rooms, I tend to find that the higher end rooms tend to be priced just below the price of a studio flat. So you might be thinking, actually, well, why would somebody stay in a shared room, a shared house in a room, if they can get a studio flat for the same price? Well, actually, there's two other key costs to consider. One is when they're taking on a studio, they'll need to furnish it. They need to buy all their furniture, sofa, TV, bed, fridge, etc., etc. Whereas with a room in a shared house, it'll be fully furnished, so they're not going to have to buy any furniture, so they haven't got that expense. The other thing is, within a shared house, the bills are included in the rent quite often. That's generally how we structure ours. Many people tend to structure them as well. It's a little bit different to some student lets, but I'm referring primarily to workers and professional house shares. Now, if they had a studio, they'd have the costs on top of their rent, for example, gas, electric, water, council tax, TV license, internet, etc., etc. So actually, when you work it out like for like, the cost of taking on a studio is considerably more than that of a room. So those tend to be the two categories of people that live in HMOs: those that like the idea of living with other people in a social environment, and those that can only afford that and their budget doesn't permit any more than that for them. Once you worked out the type of tenant that you'll be providing accommodation for, I'd encourage you to do some research into the market of what else exists there. So what are the current providers like? Are your potential competition? What's the quality of accommodation that they're currently providing, at what price point, and what type of houses? And also, very importantly, what part of the city are they predominantly based for that type of accommodation? So when you're doing this research, this will really help you get a gauge for what you may need to create if you're looking to create something similar. Or in fact, when I looked around, the quality of accommodation is very poor. So the way I looked at this, actually, I just need to provide something a little bit more nicer than what's out there right now, and we'll have much better accommodation. And that's the USP, if you like, I started with. Things are very different right now. But at that point, that's what I was looking for. So again, look in the marketplace, understand what's the competition like, what's their quality like, are they very high standard, are they poor standard? You'll probably find, particularly in the bigger cities, that there's quite a mixture, and you need to think about where do you want to position yourself within the marketplace. So I like to be at the higher end of the market. I believe there's more profit at that area. The market, you also have nicer tenants. They have to have higher salaries to be able to afford those rooms, and you have less issues and less problems with those type of properties. So a couple of tips when doing the research. First of all, a website that you could use is spareroom.co.uk, probably the biggest portal in the UK, particularly when it comes to looking for house shares for professional people. A little bit of students are on there as well, but predominantly it tends to be working people that are looking for rooms on that platform. That's a great website to use. Punch in the postcode that you're looking to work in, get an idea of what's out there in the marketplace. You'll get some pictures, occasionally some videos as well, of the quality of accommodation and also the idea of price. The other thing Spare Room will enable you to do is to be able to work out the level of demand. It's not a very accurate tool, but it's nevertheless a very useful thing to do. So you can look in a particular postcode to see how many people have registered looking for a room in that area versus how many rooms are already advertised to let. So for example, went to Birmingham, you could punch in room to let in Birmingham and see how many rooms come up as being advertised. But at the same time, you could then check the figures to see how many people are registered looking for a room in Birmingham. As I said, these are not accurate figures, but it's nice to give a little bit of a guideline in terms of where the supply and demand might be in the marketplace. The other thing I'd encourage you to do, little tip number 2 if you like, is to speak to local letting agents that specialize in that sector. Now, I emphasize specialize because if you're speaking to letting agents that are general agents, generalists if you like, they're not necessarily going to have the specialist knowledge required and understanding in running HMOs, pricing HMOs, understanding that market. It's a very, very niche market. So when in Birmingham, when I couldn't find anybody, I set up our own agency. We have kind of 500 plus tenants right now. But it's a very, very different business to that of a traditional letting agent. In fact, a story I'll share with you. Last year sometime, I had a local agent who was looking to break into this sector because they see how profitable it is, and there's many agents right now looking to do that. They're looking to add into their portfolio the ability to manage HMOs. Now, some of these are doing this quite well, but many are actually, I believe, are not doing this very well. And this was the case with this agent. They never really had the experience. They just thought, well, it's just a house, we let it. It's not different from what we already do. But it is very different, just the viewings late in the evening, for example, weekends, understanding the mindset of the tenant that you're looking at, understanding where to market the property, understand how to price it. This agent was making a mess of all these things, and they asked for some help, and I gave them some suggestions. And the landlord was actually not very happy because they thought they were going to an agent who was in the area, who said they would be able to do HMOs, but actually didn't really understand the market, and they just went on price. So just a little tip there for you: when you're speaking to agents, make sure you're speaking to agents that specialize in what you do. So for example, in Birmingham, when I talk about not being any other agents really specializing in professional lets, there are lots and lots of agents doing HMOs for students. Again, a slightly different market. So when you're speaking to the right type of agent, they've got the information and knowledge for your local patch that they can share with you and tell you, look, this is where it works, this is where it doesn't work so well, this is what you can expect price wise, and that will give you a good idea of the market. Now, also jump onto Rightmove and Zoopla and look at properties that are up for sale. Look at HMOs that might be for sale. Now, my experience, you don't see these properties come up for sale very often, but occasionally if you do, it's worth having a look. Go and look at the property as well, look at the floor plans, get an idea of how they're set out and how they're laid out. If you can go and have a look at some of those, it'll be good for your experience of just seeing how other people set up their shared houses and how they're running them. With spare room, the photos and videos will give you a very good idea from doing that too. When you've worked out exactly where you want to provide this type of accommodation within your town or city, and you jump onto Rightmove and Zoopla and you're looking for those houses, these are, for example, ones that are not already HMOs, you're looking to purchase and convert to a HMO, think about the type of property that be suitable. For me, my personal preference is the 3-story Victorian properties, the high ceilings. Those properties I find lend themselves really well for conversion of the type of style that I like, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But think about, for you, what's the right type of property? What is your potential competition already using? What's the main type of property in that area that are people using for shared houses? Think about the room sizes. Sometimes you could find a house that is in a great location, the rooms are great, except there's a little box room there, and you think, yeah, I'll just stick a single bed in it and it'll work. Well, actually, it may not work so well. It might even be that it doesn't meet the minimum requirements for room size, and then that could be a potential problem as well. So it's just thinking about the house as a holistic thing and see how that's going to work. So for example, if you're looking at 3-bedroom semi-detached houses, thinking about, again, this will depend on your budget, but thinking about, can you use the garage on the side? Could you convert that to a room? There's quite some cost involved in doing that, but that might be an additional room that you could create there. Is there scope for an extension at the back? Now, these are big refurbishment projects at the beginning, and if you're starting out, you may not want to do that, particularly if you don't have that level of experience of big refurbs. But then thinking about, how can you change the layout of that house to work? For instance, if you have to walk through a lounge to get to somewhere else, then that room is not really going to work so well as a bedroom. Even if you partition it off, it may be quite small. So it's just thinking about all these things and how that's going to work, the right number of bathrooms as well. For instance, if you've got 1 bathroom and there's 5 people, that's definitely not going to work. That's going to cause lots of problems. So, we prefer to stick to, if we can, 1 ensuite in every room, 2 people sharing 1 bathroom as a second option, and the third and worst case scenario is there's 3 people sharing 1 bathroom. So just thinking about the floor plans and layouts and see how that works for you, and that will give you an idea of what kind of properties might work well for your HMO strategy. So you've gone through the process of understanding the rules and regulations, you've done some research in the marketplace to understand your tenants and the type of properties that you use. So now we're going to look at the third and final part of this, which is understanding the numbers, crunching the numbers. After all, this is a business and it's about profit and profitability. Now, when I look at the numbers, I tend to split them into two sections, your pre-let and post-let. So what I mean by that, your pre-let is everything, all your costs incurred up to the point before you move a tenant in. And once your tenant's moved in, going forward, you've got a different set of costs. So let's look at the beginning first of all. So you're looking at a property, what costs are involved? Well, you've got the purchase price, first of all, so that's your one cost. Now, you might be using some kind of finance with that, for example, bridging. It might be you're putting a, say, 30% deposit, 70% of the purchase price is coming some kind of bridging. You've got stamp duty to consider, you've got solicitors' costs, other financing costs such as valuation fees, etc. And that's to the point to get the key. Once you've got the key from the property, you'll have some holding costs as well. So you'll start paying council tax, for example, possibly water rates. Whilst the property is sitting empty, you may also have a monthly mortgage or bridging payment or something you need to make as well. So it's important to consider those payments. And then, of course, it's the refurb itself, and that's the biggie. The refurb, it will depend on how much you're going to be looking to do. That, of course, will depend on your budget and your end outcome that you're looking to try and achieve. My personal preference is I just like to gut the properties, keep the shell and start again, create the space that we want to create, effectively end up with a brand new house. Not always possible, but that's my preference for many reasons. It means that I get the ideal layout for what I can within that footprint of that property, but also I know that all the plumbing, the electrics, everything's brand new, and from an ongoing maintenance point of view, it'll be minimal as well. So one of the important aspects when looking at a HMO, a shared accommodation of any sort, is the compliance with the fire regulation. So it's important from a fire safety point of view, your smoke detectors, your fire alarm system, fire doors, self-closing doors, thumb turns on the locks, all these aspects, emergency lighting, things you need to be thinking about. A guide that you can use in the course, I'll put the information for that up on this video. That's a guide I'd encourage you to read to understand a little bit more about fire safety, particularly in shared houses. So if you're doing this for the first time, I'd encourage you to speak to a number of different builders in terms of getting quotes for the amount of work that you want to do. If possible, try and get them to break those figures down so you can get a gauge for what's involved. For example, what's the cost of the rewire? What's the cost of the fire alarm panel? What's the cost of the central heating system? You know, what's the cost of the extension that you're going to build? You know, whatever those things are, try and, if possible, as much as you can, to break them down to have some kind of comparison. So for our projects, what I do in my investors projects, we have a template that we follow. We have a guide in terms of how much we're looking to spend. Now, typically, I will probably spend about £60,000 or £70,000 on a refurb. That's a major refurb. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend the same amount of money on a property. Now, of course, depending on where you're in the country, if you're down south towards the southeast and London, your budget might be higher because your costs may be higher. And if you're up north in one of the northern towns, it might be that your costs are lower because maybe the labor costs are lower that you can access as well. So once you've got that big chunk of cost considered and you understand that, the other things then also to consider is once the build work is finished, the furnishing of the property and all the appliances. So I typically budget about £600 per bedroom in terms of kitting out that room. That's all the furniture, blinds, canvas, etc. Getting that room completely finished, about £600. And you've got communal spaces, your living room, lounge, the appliances in the kitchen, the fridges, washing machine, the small appliances, microwave, toaster, kettle, etc. All these things you need to think about, right down to knives and forks. Remember, with a shared house, particularly when we're talking about professional lets, they want to move in with everything ready to move in. Apart from their suitcase with their clothes and their laptop, they don't need anything else. They're ready to move in. So once you've considered that cost, a cost to remember that sometimes gets forgotten is a few other little things that may pop along the way as well. So you might need to apply for a license. So in Birmingham, I think it's about £1,150 right now for a license. So consider that cost. And also there might be some, say, cleaning that needs to be done on the property once your builders are finished, a thorough clean, once all the furniture's in as well. You might get some professional photography done or even videography as well. So considering all those costs, and all these I bundle together as my pre-let costs. These are all the costs that I need to incur from the point of acquiring the property to have it finished, ready for the tenants to move in. Now, once the tenants start moving in, I look at that as a separate set of costs. So I see that as post-let costs. Now, the post-let costs, or post-let costs even, are those for the ongoing running of that particular property. So what are they going to be? Well, actually you need to consider that you'll be probably paying all the bills each month, the running costs. What are those bills? Well, you'll have gas, electric, water, council tax, TV license, possibly cleaners, gardeners, internet access. All these are costs that you'll probably pick up in terms of running that property. As I said earlier, the expectation from the tenants will be that all this is provided, they don't have any other costs. Just a little tip on TV licenses: if you have locks on your rooms, which on HMOs generally speaking will do, the TV license that you provide is only for the one, the communal area. The tenants are responsible for their own additional TV licenses in their bedrooms if they're using a TV there. So all these collective running costs, we tend to average out about £85 per person per month. So for example, in a 6-bedroom shared house, that's about £510 of the income that comes in is allocated towards these costs: gas, electric, water, council tax, TV license, cleaners, gardeners, internet, etc. Then you also need to consider the management. At the beginning, you may choose to self-manage, but if you want to grow this as a business and you want the income, you really don't want to change your current job for that one of a property manager. This is really about building a profitable business that's giving you the income. So finding a professional property management agency that can help you with that. So as I mentioned earlier, so at the beginning I couldn't find anybody, so we created our own. Now I have 12 staff in that business that manage the portfolio of my properties and also other landlords as well. Your agency fees will vary probably between 8 and 15% because there's a huge amount of work involved in running HMOs. I certainly wouldn't go for the cheapest one because there'll probably be a reason that it's cheap, because you haven't got a complete service. If you want it to look after really well, make sure you find a good agent that's good at doing managing the properties that you have. For example, if it's student lets, just find a good student manager. If it's professional lets, make sure you find an agency that specializes just in professional lets. So other costs to consider as well. You've got all the running costs we just talked about. You've got the management costs. You've still got voids to consider. You might have some voids throughout the year in the property. It's important to consider some. Even if you run the properties well, you may get some voids, and also maintenance as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm doing a major refurb on a property, it's pretty much a brand new house apart from the 4 walls and the roof. So my maintenance costs, my expectation will be that they'll be minimal. There'll be some maintenance costs, but generally speaking, there'll be very, very little for the first few years, because pretty much the property is brand new. I'm not expecting any costs. The builder will have provided some warranties as well. So if there is any issues, leaks, they tend to take care of that within their warranties. So now if we look at the costs going out, we can try and work out what the profitability would be on a project, because ultimately that's what we need to work out, how profitable it is to do this type of project. So let's say, for example, say I've got a 6-bedroom, 6 ensuite house share, which is typical of the properties that I have. Now, £500 a room, 6 room, that's about £3,000 a month. So if you've got £3,000 a month coming in, let's say you've got about £500 for your running costs. You've got, let's say, about £300 for management. On that property, you've got probably a mortgage, maybe about £1,000. If my maths are right, you probably have about £1,200-ish left off that. This assuming it's fully occupied, it's up and running. So you're making about £1,200 a month from that particular property. Again, I said you kind of need to consider some maintenance and potentially some voids as well, but that means you've got a reasonable profit. Now, my personal view is that we should be generating at least £1,000 a month from each property to make this kind of business work, because it's a lot of work involved and also cash hungry in terms of setting up these types of projects. So if you're making about £1,000 a month per property, very profitable from that point of view, but you also need to consider how much capital has actually gone in. Now, I'm not going to go into that in this particular video. Maybe something we can look at another point. If that's something you're interested in, ping me a message, put a comment in the comment section, and maybe I can do a video on the costings there separately. But ultimately, what you now can work out is what is it that you need to pay for a property, what is it that it's going to cost you to renovate and convert it and get up and running, so your pre-let costs we talked about, and then what income are you going to generate from that property once it's tenanted, what costs you're going to have associated with the running of that property, and what you're going to be left with in terms of profit, because that's what it's all about. Now, the reason many people beat this big drum about doing HMOs is because they're exceptionally more profitable than many other types of investments. I'm not saying they're most profitable, but they certainly are a very profitable strategy, and one that I've used for many years now and continue to do so going forward. But you have to understand, is it right for you? And hopefully these 3 tools that I've shared with you today, 3 things you can use to help you understand whether it's right for you. Go through that process, see if it's the right thing for you before you make the decision whether to switch your current investing method into HMOs, or whether you're looking to embark on HMOs as a journey going forward. Now I'm going to answer your questions, and the first question is from Andy Ellard. Good to hear from you, Andy. Andy's asking about a 6-bedroom house on a 2-story property, whether he needs permission for that. So some of this I've covered earlier in the video, but let me just summarize what would be relevant here. First of all, if it's a 6-bedroom property and it's on 2 stories, we talk about bedrooms, but technically speaking, we're actually talking about people, not rooms. But let's say it's 6 people in a 2-story house. Do you need any permission for that? Well, based on what we were talking about earlier on, changing from C3 to C4, i.e. a family house to a HMO, you do that under permitted development. So there's no issue there. However, Andy also mentioned that this is an Article 4 area. That means that that change of use from C3 to C4 has now been removed. So actually, you can't change its use without going through the planning process. So Andy, for that one, you'll need to go through a planning application and to get approval from changing it from C3 to C4 first of all. And the license, if it's in Birmingham, would not be applicable, because Birmingham will only license properties that are on 3 or more stories. So in this case, you don't need a license, a HMO license. Effectively, it'd be an unlicensed HMO. However, you would need planning permission to change its use. So hopefully you found that useful. The next question is from Jill. Jill's looking to purchase her first property at the moment, which will be converted to a HMO. And Jill's question really is about finding builders to do the job and the potential cost of the renovation, and possibly the cost of a loft conversion as well. So some of this I touched on earlier on as well. Hopefully I've covered some of these things for you, but just picking up on a couple of other things. One of the things that I would do, as mentioned earlier, is to break down what we think the cost of things are. It's a little bit like your budgeting. So for example, typically if I'm looking at a project, we'll have a template that we use, and we look at, say, the ensuite room will probably cost us between £2,000 to £3,000, depending on the number of ensuites we're doing, the configuration work that needs to be involved, the drainage that needs to go with that. So they'll vary slightly, but that's how much I'll budget. It might be a fire alarm panel. I'll be looking at between £1,800 and £2,500 for a cost of installing a complete fire alarm system with the panel as well. If I'm looking at, say, floor coverings, that's when the property is finished, the refurbishment work has been done. I need to put the carpets in, the laminate floor, if there's any lino. On a 6-bedroom house, I'll typically budget about £2,000. Might be a little bit more, some of these might be a little bit less, but it's a starting point in terms of budgeting. And if you're further south than where I am in Birmingham, so if you're, say, down in London, your cost might be higher because your labour cost might be higher. And if you're in one of the northern towns, your cost may be lower, again, because your labour cost may be lower. But at the beginning, what I would recommend is getting a number of different quotes from builders to get an idea of what they're suggesting, and try and encourage them, if possible, to break it down. At the end of the day, with the best will in the world, builders are builders. They're not accounting technicians, they're not administrators. So, they may not present the information to you in the detailed scope that you necessarily want. And if you employ one of these large companies that are able to do all that for you really well, it's probably because they've got a much, much higher cost base, they've got higher labor costs as well, and you'll end up paying for that. Now, when looking for a builder, what I would do, I would always look at one which I can get as a referral from somebody else. So what I mean is one that's done some work for somebody else that you can go and have a look at, make sure you're happy with the quality work, the finish of the work that's been done there, but also be able to speak to the person that instructed them to see how that relationship went and if it went well. The two questions I would really think about when deciding to employ a builder is, one, is what's the most important thing for you in choosing the right builder? And the other question is, for the builder, what's the most important thing for the builder in choosing which project they want to take on? Now, really, if you think about that, when you're thinking about what's the most important thing, it will help you understand if it's going to be the right person to work with. So for instance, it may be for you as the developer, the important thing for you is having somebody that will also project manage, that will have good communication with you in terms of what's going on. That might be really important for you. For the builder, it might be a case of somebody who can make decisions very quickly because sometimes things might change and they want somebody who's going to be decisive, and also an agreed payment plan, and that payment be made on time. So when you understand what's important for the people you're potentially going to be working with, you'll be able to work out, actually, is this going to be a good fit? But I emphasize working with builders that actually you've got as a referral. For quoting purposes, you might get a few different builders you don't know or don't have any referrals for, just to try and get a gauge for the numbers, but then use one that you've got a referral for as well. Then the other point in terms of a loft conversion, typically, again, it depends whether you're building dormers, how the staircase is going to go in, what's actually going to go in there, you're going to put a bathroom in there or not. But typically I would budget between £18,000 and £25,000 to have a compliant attic room or loft conversion that's going to be used as a bedroom within a HMO. So if you have any questions, or if you want your question answered, please put it in the comment section below and I'll do my best to make sure I answer that. Or even if you've got some suggestions on videos that you'd like to see me do for you, make sure you put that in the comment section and I'll do that for you. My question of the day for you is, what's your thoughts on HMO as a strategy going forward? Make sure to put your comments in the comment section below, and I look forward to reading those and answering those as well. So look, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please subscribe to get notifications of more videos just like this, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. My name is Saj Hussain, also known as a property joint venture expert, and more importantly, your partner for wealth creation through property.